Hi, hello. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. There we go. Hoping you can all see that. And I'm Rebecca Dam. I am assistant head teacher at Sharples School, and I have been part of the Word for All community in Bolton since it started, so a few years ago. And I'm going to talk through a whole school approach to literacy, and that has been part of the work with Words for All, and a lot of it has been informed by talking to the other founding members of the Words for All team in Bolton and working alongside Whole Education. I'm just trying to work out how I can see my screen. Sorry. Nora, my video keeps turning itself off. Apologies, I don't know why that's happening.
You're on now, we can see you.
Lovely, sorry about that. There we go. Okay, there we go. Right, so I'm going to talk, as I said, about my whole school approach to literacy, what we've done at Sharples School, and how that's fed into the Words for All programme. So, firstly, for the whole school approach, just some general advice and general things that I found as we were looking at whole school literacy at Sharples School. The first thing would be one priority at a time. So there are 4 strands of literacy. There is reading, writing, vocabulary, and oracy. That's a lot to cover at once. So find a priority that suits your school, that you think is most needed in your school. Secondly, it's really important to raise the profile. So a lot of what you'll be doing as a whole school literacy lead is raising the profile of the importance of literacy, making sure it's at the front of teachers' minds in all subject areas. And to do that, it's important to start with the why. So that was very much our starting point for Words for All. We started with the why. We had this idea of disadvantaged, of boys particularly, that in Bolton were the students who had that language gap, had that vocabulary gap, and that I took back to Sharples School to make sure that when I was selling this to staff, I was starting with the why they should prioritise this in their classrooms, regardless of what subject they were. Another thing that I'm going to talk about today is the importance of weaving literacy into your systems. So, for example, making it second nature to staff to include vocabulary strategies, literacy strategies. So I'm going to show you how we've made literacy part of our systems, for example, observation forms, curriculum plans, so that it is part of the very fabric of the school's curriculum and the school's quality assurance processes. And finally, one size doesn't fit all. So when you're looking at whole school literacy, it doesn't mean that what they do in maths will necessarily work exactly the same in history. So you have to be ready to adapt to the different subject areas you're going to prioritize and support, and to make sure that you're looking at disciplinary literacy, so you're allowing the subject areas to adapt what you bring to this plan. So the first thing we have across school is our Language for Learning foundations. So we've got these ideas across school as reminders to staff what they should be thinking about in every lesson. Those are reading for meaning and reading for purpose, writing, vocabulary, and oracy. Those we ask staff to think about in terms of underpinning everything they do in the classroom. And for me, when I was working with the Words for All team, my first priority that I looked at was vocabulary and how we could raise pupils' language acquisition and close the gap between disadvantaged students and non-disadvantaged through looking at vocabulary and explicit vocabulary teaching. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we did that. So first of all, start with the why. So this is something that Alex Quigley shows when he presents. He looks at the Key Stage 2 SATs paper. So this is a SATs paper from Key Stage 2 a few years ago. And you can just see from the very first line, dawn was casting spun gold threads across a rosy sky over Soambona Game Reserve. Already you can see the high expectations of vocabulary that are there at Key Stage 2. So that was my starting point with selling this to staff, that there's already a lot expected of Year 6 pupils. As well as that, I looked at the GCSE specifications and papers. So this is from a BTEC PE paper. So we've got multi-stage, we've got approximately, with audio tape. We've got a lot of subject specific and even tier 2 vocabulary there, like factors, validity. Also a foundation maths paper. Again, lots of subject specific tier 3 vocabulary, compound interest, but also tier 2 vocabulary as well. So the types of account, reference to the bank name, so things that and a lot of reading to do for students. So this was part of the why, to show staff that whatever subject they were in, a vocabulary approach to teaching was going to be really important for them. I chose to look at vocabulary for part of the Words for All programme specifically because it was really important to our students as well. So this is from a few years ago, a GCSE student, and you can see how the vocabulary, not their knowledge of Romeo and Juliet, is really holding them back. So Shakespeare creates an atmosphere of feeling a bit sorry for Romeo because he is a bit messed up by Juliet. So I could see in a lot of our students that vocabulary was a weakness. So that's what I chose to focus on whole school. So what did we do? So this is part of my first year with the Words for All group. I decided to focus on morphology and etymology, particularly in vocabulary instruction. So my aims were to develop word consciousness in every child, so that they were more curious in exploring vocabulary. They were asking questions about vocabulary, to develop their knowledge of morphology and etymology, and to make the hidden process of vocabulary development visible. That is a quotation from Alex Quigley's Closing the Vocabulary Gap. And I was really wanting to make sure that staff didn't just take it for granted that students were acquiring this vocabulary, that they were actually explicitly teaching it. So a real focus on what we did was on this idea of tiered vocabulary. So the idea that tier 1 vocabulary is high frequency in speech. Students know that vocabulary by and large. Tier 2 vocabulary is high frequency in written text but less common in speech, and tier 3 is the subject specific academic vocabulary. And particularly this idea that as teachers we are more likely to skim by the tier 2 vocabulary, so we might use words like beneficial, required, maintain in our teachers speak, but we might not explicitly teach those words. And also the review of tier 3 vocabulary, so we made sure that students remembered it. So we really focused what we did whole school on that concept. How did we do it? So this is at Sharple School. What we looked at was staff CPD, first of all, because I wanted to, as I said, raise the profile of the importance of vocabulary across the school in every subject. So Twilight's inset, professional development, focused on vocabulary and how you could explicitly teach words. We also had a coaching program where we are in coaching triads, and each pop into each other's classrooms to observe and then feed back. And vocabulary was a coaching focus a couple of times throughout the year so that teachers could see approaches in other subject areas and get ideas, as well as feeding back to that teacher on how it had worked. We have a teaching and learning newsletter as well, and I wrote articles for that, again, all about keeping it at the forefront of all staff's minds. Regular reminders in staff briefing, signposting with bookmarks and prompts and posters, which I'm going to show you in a second, and in the systems, and I'm going to show you how we did that as well. So embedding vocabulary instruction into the system, so as I said, it becomes part of the fabric of the school. So this is a Year 7 curriculum plan for geography, and all of our curriculum plans now have key vocabulary for every half term as part of the progression map of what students are going to learn. The reason we did that is it asks staff in every subject area to think about what is the key vocabulary that they expect students to know at the end of each unit, at the end of each half term in their subject area. How does that progress? So making sure that they're not repeating the same vocabulary all the time, but that is progressing. And that's really important for retrieval as well, and students storing this vocabulary in their long-term memories, because staff starting in geography in Year 8 can check that students have learnt that vocabulary. So every single subject area has vocabulary mapped out on their curriculum plan from Year 7 to 11. For raising the profile, we did have a whole school strategy for looking at vocabulary, but this is very much flexible and can be adapted to suit in each subject area. But this is taken from Reading Reconsidered by Doug Lemov, and the idea is there's a little bit of a script that teachers can use to explicitly teach words. So that is based around selecting the word. So that's asking teachers to think about the Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary that they want to teach students for each lesson. Defining it, because what we found was teachers might not always stop to give a really clear definition of a new word. Modelling its use, so the teacher using it within a sentence, showing how a scientist would use that word, how a historian would use that word, and then student practice, verbally and then written. So to make sure that that was at the top of all staff's mind, I put this onto a bookmark. That went out to all staff, and they have it with them in their planners. Some have stuck it on their walls in their classrooms when we were allowed our own classrooms in those heady days. And they use that script when they are teaching a new word. So the instruction of vocabulary is much more structured. These are our lesson summary sheets. So when lesson planning, staff use these. Particularly our trainees and our NQTs would use this for their observations with their mentors and their professional mentor, and then staff for observations. So again, when staff are planning, they're thinking about vocabulary because we have that key vocabulary section on the planning summary sheets. So these are some examples from science, where it's just meant that the NQT here has had to think about vocabulary and the Tier 2 and Tier 3 words that they want to teach in that lesson. We also have knowledge organisers for every year group linked to our curriculum plans. And the knowledge organisers, we've got one here for photography and one for maths, all have key vocabulary on there, linking to our curriculum plans. So again, students are not just forgetting the words that they've learned, but really making sure they revise them and embed them and then use them throughout the 5 years. Another approach was using form time. So we used form time to look at etymology and morphology. And the reason that I chose this approach is I wanted students to be able to not just learn a word of the week, but be able to make connections between vocabulary in different subject areas. So in this example, they're looking at the root bene, which is Latin for well or good. And they're looking at how these words are important in science, in RS, in English, in PE. And these words, these tier 2 and 3 words that they might come across in different subject areas, all link. And it's provided them with a way to work out the meanings of difficult academic words themselves. So these were weekly sessions. These are still running. So these have been running for 3 years. So students are really used to them now. Staff have got really used to delivering them. They're 15 minutes, and each week as a school we have a root of the week focus that staff can incorporate into their lessons as well. So the impact has been that student feedback has been that students can talk about the new words they've learned, the new words that they've been able to use in different subject areas. So examples here, I've used the word utopia in English and history, hypothermia in science, benevolent in RS. Staff feedback was really positive. So staff, for example, saying, I always ensure I relate key vocabulary to its root, for example, in photosynthesis. The students really remember the definitions of keywords when they understand the root of the word. The form time activities in CPD are a continual reminder of the importance of strong vocabulary and provide me with knowledge of how to encourage pupils to use higher level vocabulary in my own subject. And it has encouraged the students to discuss keywords and vocabulary more. And what we found was that that was definitely true. I observe a lot around the school, and students are much more inquisitive about vocabulary now. They ask more questions. They want to learn new words. They want to find out what new words mean. So we've got that word consciousness across the school much more than we did have. In our Ofsted report in May 2019, they commented that pupils have many more opportunities to develop their vocabulary, write at length and read widely. So they recognise the work we've done on that. So that was my first Words for All project. And my second focus was looking at reading. So this is obviously an ongoing focus, and this is something that now, as part of the Words for All project, I'm looking at more closely. So for reading, first again started with the importance of it. As Daniel Willingham said, our brain's privilege story. So this idea that students learn better when they have this sense of story. They can read something and have this beginning, middle and end idea, even if it's in science or maths. Reading builds background knowledge, grows vocabulary and allows pupils to access the full curriculum offer, is from Mary Myatt, Back on Track. And also, reading and vocabulary has become much more high profile on the Ofsted inspection framework, where it says a rigorous approach to the teaching of reading develops learners' confidence and enjoyment in reading. I also think it's become even more of a focus. This is definitely reflected in our reading data this year, and this is from the DFE report that they produced in January 21. They found that all year groups have experienced a learning loss in reading. In primary schools, these were typically between 1.7 and 2 months, and in years 8 and 9, 1.6 and 2 months respectively. And we found that backed up that students are further behind than they should be with their reading. So it's more than important than ever the work that the Words for All groups are doing and the projects that you're doing, looking at how we can promote literacy techniques, particularly with making sure the gaps are closed with reading. So what did we do at Sharples? So we looked at developing a whole school reading culture, making sure that reading happens across the curriculum, so students are reading in as many subject areas as possible. That teachers of all subjects know how to teach reading, and then intervention for students with reading ages below chronological age is really incisive and impactful, and no students are left behind. So again, we do have whole school reading strategies that can be adapted depending on subject area. We base these on reciprocal reading strategies of predicting, clarifying, questioning, and summarizing. And I've provided training on this for different department areas and whole schools so that teachers are thinking about how they approach text rather than just giving the text to students and asking them to read that for meaning. They're using these strategies to break that down for them. We also have a reading approach that takes into account the different levels of reading ages. So here we've linked what we're going to do to where students are at based on their reading ages. This is following the GL assessment reading tests. We can decide which pathway students are going to be placed on based on their reading age. So there's lots of whole school things for all students. For example, reading book is part of the basic equipment. We have accelerated reading, so students are encouraged to read regularly and take quizzes to show they've understood their books. We have a reading rich curriculum, but then there are approaches that are just for students who need more support with their reading. So if they are less than 2 years behind their chronological age, they have more support from the teacher in their reading lessons, more focused discussions, and they do a form time reading scheme with regular rewards. And if they are more than 2 years behind their chronological age, they have weekly form time sessions on reading. They have weekly one-to-one reading through volunteer readers. And this year we've used reading mentors because we've not been able to bring people from outside of the school in. And one-to-one reading intervention with an HLTA. We've also got corrective reading this year, which is a direct instruction reading program for our intervention form. So the intervention forms that we have that are in that form based on their weaker literacy skills have extra sessions where they look at their reading skills in a more focused way. And the corrective reading is what I'm looking at for the Words for All project this year and seeing its impact on particular students. We have reading across the curriculum. So, for example, this is from a history scheme. So this shows how they've taken the idea of the reciprocal reading whole school strategies and they've adapted them to fit their subject area. So rather than just giving them a text and asking them to read it and answer questions on it, maybe they've taught this strategy of giving a title for each paragraph and then summarizing each paragraph in 1 or 2 bullet points. And that works really well in geography and in history, where they've used this strategy to develop reading skills. History is taught much more through texts than it would following the work I've done with history. So they now look at a text, they take information from that text, extracts from that text, and students have to do more reading of challenging texts supported through by their teacher. So they're not just reading kind of little chunks of information from a PowerPoint, but we have much higher expectations of what they can do reading wise in their lessons. Same in English, we're giving them, this is for Key Stage 4, further reading to do at home. So this is part of a homework booklet where our more able students have to go away and read text by themselves to embellish their knowledge. Again, lots of challenge in the reading that we give to our students. And I think modelling has been a big part of improving how we teach reading at the school. So every classroom now has a visualiser, and staff are more confident in modelling annotations of texts, breaking text down, looking at questions and what the words mean in the question, and using the visualiser to model active reading to students. And this is from the EEF report on literacy in secondary schools. I've just linked it there. But they say their step 7 of their advice says to provide high quality literacy interventions for struggling students. So I think that's really important, that you've got a high profile for literacy whole school for all students, but then as well as that, there needs to be extra for the students who have started secondary school behind their peers. So as I've said, we have an intervention form where students are placed to have more support and more literacy provision based on their information from primary schools. We have those students taking part in the corrective reading programme. They also have one-to-one reading mentors, and we use the reading age assessments to, at each step, at the end of each term in the year, assess how that is working. Is it having an impact? Are there any students that should not be in that form anymore or should not be having that intervention? Or are there any students emerging that need more intervention? Okay, so I've spoken about what we've done at Sharples and how the Words for All project has kind of developed here. A lot of ideas from these books that I definitely recommend has informed, and Reading Reconsidered I mentioned as well from Doug Lemov has really informed what we've done. Okay, thank you very much. Any questions?
Well, thank you ever so much, Rebecca. If anybody, I think we've got a few moments to have some questions before we go on to Alison. That was so useful and informative. I've written lots of notes and I don't even work at a school at the moment, Rebecca. So I can only imagine the notes that other colleagues have made. Are there any immediate questions that anybody has, or anything that people want to put on the chat, which perhaps then Rebecca can respond to? I'm just looking down. Rebecca, would we be able to have a copy of your PowerPoint? Would that be possible?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, of course. Yeah.
Fantastic. So alongside the recording, everybody, we will put the PowerPoint, because I desperately want to go back to your honeycombs as well, right at the start. So I think there was lots of really interesting information there. Jill is asking what your subject specialism is, Rebecca.
I'm an English teacher. So I suppose I've had a bit of an advantage there in terms of English being my subject specialism, but I think there is just so much information out there. It was weird that when we started doing Words for All, it overlapped with me seeing that vocabulary would be a real weakness for our students. It was something we really needed to work on. And then that year, Alex Quigley's book was published as well. So it kind of was all perfect timing. And so closing the vocabulary gap, closing the reading gap were really informative. Etymology online is like where I am all the time, because that's been perfect for looking at the root words. And also Doug Lemov's work on reading and Daniel Willingham's work on reading is really good as well. So there's lots out there. If you're not a subject specialist, there's lots out there.
Thank you ever so much, Rebecca. Rebecca,